You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Dr. Shima Hamidi, assistant professor at Johns Hopkins University, to talk about the report, A National Investigation of the Impacts of Lane Width on Traffic Safety. We chat about how they collected data for the study and determined narrower lanes are safer. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Happy New Year and thanks infinitely to all the transit planners, bus drivers, advocates, and friends that support the show. To join this merry gang of zoning misfits and transit lovers, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month will get you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month will get you one of our transportation scarves. We appreciate everyone's support over the last year and look forward to sharing more episodes in 2024. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Also, if you want to support the show in other ways, check out the show notes in your podcatcher or go to theoverheadwire.com to find links to our Cars Are Cholesterol merch, our Talking Headways book club shop at bookshop.org, or sign up for a 2-week free trial of our 18-year-old daily newsletter and archive. Thanks for supporting, and this year make sure to listen to this space for opportunities for happy hours, live performances, and updated information on coming attractions. Hope everyone starts 2024 out right, and now let's get back to the show. Dr. Shima Hamidi, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thank you, Jeff, for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. We had you on episode 99 with Reed Ewing, who also worked on this paper as well, and John Rennie, and that was back in 2016. So how have you been since 2016?
A lot happened since then. I moved to Baltimore, to Johns Hopkins University, and my work has been shifting more toward transportation and health impacts of transportation and built environment. And recently we got a $10 million grant to launch a new center on climate change and transportation, which we are really excited about. So this Lane Width project is kind of part of that. We're working on the expansion of this project in the new center and hopefully many more to see in the next 5 years.
That's awesome. You know, one thing I asked folks, and I don't know if I asked you this last time you were on the show, but I want to know how you got into transportation and public health even. How did you kind of make that connection? And was it when you were a young child, or was it something that happened later on in life?
I think it always was fascinated by transportation. I am from Iran, and public transit is a huge deal there, probably the largest mode of transportation. And so I used to take transit whenever I want to go, a great metro system. So when I came to the US in 2011, I was kind of surprised to see look at the portion of commuting or transportation that's done by driving relative to public transit or walking or biking. And I wanted to learn more and see, why is these patterns of commuting or transportation dominant in the US? And I was so lucky to be able to work with Reed Ewing. Reed was my advisor, doctoral dissertation and study advisor, and still co-author on most of my research and work. And, he's one of the top transportation experts in the US. So we get to work together on different aspects of transportation, and that, is something that continued to be the case from 2011 to today.
And you moved recently from Arlington to Baltimore. How's that change been?
A huge change. Unbelievable.
I should say Arlington, Texas.
Arlington, Texas. Yeah. So I did not have a driver license before going to Arlington, Texas. Even in Salt Lake City, Utah, I used to take transit and light rail whenever I wanted to go. In Texas, I was totally, relying on car and driving. And I remember when I wanted to go to Texas, everyone was telling me, before you get a house, buy a car. And that has not been the case here in Baltimore. Even though I still kept my car, but very rarely I'm using that to go to work, to go to major destinations, my daily destinations. I don't need to drive, and I like it very much.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, let's talk about your report, A National Investigation on the Impacts of Lane Width on Traffic Safety, Narrowing Travel Lanes as an Opportunity to Promote Biking and Pedestrian Facilities Within the Existing Roadway Infrastructure. That's quite a mouthful of a title, but I like it. I want to dive into the report. I want to start where the idea of lane widths come from, like the basic background of the width of streets, Who initially decided what widths were appropriate and how are they implemented?
Great question. So the standards on lane widths has not changed for years, for decades. It goes back to well before 2000, where really the main source that everyone is relying on for these standards is the AASHTO Green Book, which comes from the associations of civil and traffic engineers and state DOTs, reps. And it's kind of has been, traffic engineers call it the Bible. And it's really the book and the standards that everyone is referring to. Everyone is citing that and everyone is using that almost in every state that you look. And the standard that is there typically is looking for 11 or 12 feet for arterials as the minimum. So we've interviewed several state DOTs and really looking at the process that they use to make decisions on lane widths. And most of them just have been telling us that we rely on AASHTO Green Book.
Do you know where the lane widths in the AASHTO Green Book came from? Was it a kind of a panel of quote unquote experts that were putting things together?
I am not sure about where it goes back to those standards. I can just compare that with standards, for example, in Europe, and that's way wider than European streets. For the same road class in Europe, the average lane width is 8.2 foot. And here we have minimum of 11 to 12. And so if you think about that 3 foot extra per lane that we have here, and if you just multiply that by the number of lanes, it's exactly the amount of space you need to add a bike lane, which is not happening here in most cities. But again, other countries, other developed countries with a fraction of traffic fatalities of the US have been doing that and have absolutely no problem.
We recently discussed the topic of traffic safety with Kerry Watkins and David Ederer and their idea of a safe systems pyramid. And one of the main things I took from that discussion specifically was greater speed and kinetic energy creates more potential for traffic deaths. And so one of the ways we design roads, and I read this in your report, seems to be the complete opposite idea of being more permissive about speeding. So we allow people to speed, and we think that designing roads in a way that allows a little bit more speeding might be safer. I'm wondering if you can kind of expound upon that and maybe where that idea comes from.
Yeah, exactly, Jeff. You just put it together beautifully. The traditional traffic engineering mindset is that we should design roads in a way to minimize errors, minimize the error of drivers. And so their justification is that wider lanes and several other design features that make driving fast and convenient would minimize drivers' error. But I mean, there's this new approach that mostly transportation planners and urban designers advocate for that says we should design the streets in a way to take care of the most vulnerable users of the street, pedestrian and cyclists. And if we take care of them, then drivers also will be safe. But if you look at the streets in the US, historically, all the way back to 50s and 60s, and even now, in most cities, what you see is the quiet opposite. Streets that are wide, with minimum level of complexity and the number of objects on the street that, again, with this mindset that they call it forgiving driving or forgiving design, to make the driver's error minimal. But again, when you look at the number of crashes and fatalities, it shows that it's quite opposite, just as you mentioned. US has one of the highest rates of traffic fatalities by far, like 4 times more than other countries, other developed countries. Traffic fatalities is the leading cause of deaths for people aged 16 to 54. And it's just getting worse and worse, even for pedestrian and cyclists. I remember reading somewhere that 2020 just marked the deadliest year for pedestrians in 40-year history of tracking pedestrian fatalities. So all of these numbers are telling us that that doesn't work. Drivers are so sensitive about the environment surrounding them. And so if the environment doesn't give them the sense of safety or, make them to be more cautious, then they gotta drive slower, and that will reduce the chances of traffic crashes and fatalities.
And that's something you talk about in the report is kind of that built environment factors make a difference. Street trees, building setbacks might have an impact. What made you want to kind of think about those in addition to lane widths as something that might impact how fast or slow people drove?
Great question. So if you think of two scenarios, one is you're driving on a road that is in a rural area, nothing happening in any side of the street. There is no trees, no objects, nothing else, no sidewalk, no bike lane, versus a similar street in the same class, same lanes, same speed limit, but in downtown area. On the first case, you are gonna just speed up as a driver and just go fast because you have this sense of safety, sense of nothing is gonna happen. All of those items, design factors on the second scenario, the downtown street, that might give drivers the sense of busyness, complexity, and make them to drive more cautiously are the factors that we try to control in this study. So factors such as tree coverage, pedestrian furniture, width of sidewalk, number of lanes, street setback, traffic calming devices in the street. Even we had a variable that would measure the sense of motion in the street, like how much you have other users of street, like pedestrian and cyclists on the same street sharing space with cars, which again make drivers drive slower and more carefully. We try to control for all of these factors in addition to lane widths.
So then what did you find when you put all these things together?
We found that, again, first, the context matters. So again, that street, there's a huge difference between the street on that rural area with no complexity or street objects versus all of these 21 design factors that we control for. And when you control for all of these factors, then you see that not only lane widths or narrower lanes don't increase the number of crashes. In many cases, actually, it's quite the opposite. You see that wider lanes are more dangerous, experience higher number of crashes than their narrower counterparts. And I'm talking about, for example, 12-foot lanes versus 9 or 10. We found that 12-foot lanes have actually significantly higher number of crashes than 9 or 10-foot lane, which is counter to the street design practice and most policies and lane width standards that you see currently happening in the US.
And to clarify, this is non-intersection collisions that you looked at as well, something that I think a lot of folks will look at the collisions, and a lot of them happen at intersections, but this is on roads, dependent on the lane widths, and then also it's the non-intersection crashes, correct?
That's correct. About 40% of crashes happen in the intersection, and we did not include them because lane width really doesn't have anything to do with intersection. And so there are a bunch of other factors that might affect crashes at the intersections. But, really what the lane widths or number of lanes could impact how many non-intersection crashes you see across the street. And that was the outcome variables in this study.
And the speeds had something to do with it too, the speed limits on the streets, I imagine.
Absolutely. So we also broke down the sample, street samples that we had in our study, which is more than 1,100 streets from 7 different cities, to different speed classes. And the most interesting findings we had were for the street with the speed class of 20 to 25 mile per hour and 30 to 35 mile per hour. For 20 to 25, we found that different lane width values have absolutely no difference in terms of number of crashes. It doesn't matter if it's 9 foot, 10 foot, 11 or 12 foot. We think that's because at 20 to 25 miles per hour, the drivers are slow enough that lane width differences might not impact the likelihood of crash happening. But when you go to 30 to 35 miles per hour, absolutely different. You will see that 12-foot lanes and 11-foot lanes have significantly higher number of crashes than 10 or 9. And that's why we think that's the speed class where you begin to see the wider lanes give drivers the sense of safety and likelihood of higher speeds that might lead to higher number of crashes.
You know what's really interesting about that finding at the 30 to 35 mile per hour level is that you always see the chart of pedestrian collisions and fatalities and the possibility of serious injury increasing around that level, right? When you get past 30 miles per hour, that's when the curve goes up significantly from that collision aspect with pedestrians and cyclists. So it's interesting to see how that works actually with the lane widths too, where collisions become more prevalent when you get past that kind of that 30 mile per hour threshold, that high 20 mile per hour threshold.
Yes, I think the two actually correlates when you see that as you move toward 20 to 25 to 30 to 35, the number of crashes increase and the number of crashes increase in lane widths also increase. And I want to say that this road class 30 to 35 actually is the best candidate for adding a bike lane or sidewalk because it's not a residential area, not a local road, but it's in mostly arterials or principal arterials where you see they are connecting busy parts of city together and typically are more likely to be used by pedestrian and cyclists. And so you see that this is the class that is the highest potential for bike lane and sidewalks, highest number of crashes compared to slower speeds, and also typically wider lanes.
Yeah, because the engineers have decided that they want people to be safe going faster, right? That's the trick.
And when that mindset of, let's design streets to help drivers for a convenient and fast driving comes with these components of we design streets for fast driving. And whenever we want to slow down the traffic, we will use the speed limit. Posted speed limit never works. Mm-hmm. If you want to make that work, you have to have 24/7 monitoring traffic and having enforcement in place. Otherwise, drivers are going to speed up if they can, if they get the opportunity, if they have this sense of it's okay. Speed limit is not going to be forcing drivers to make that speed actually work. And so how about not going with the speed limit and going with the design features of street to come up with the speed that we have in mind for that specific street. That's really what is the foundation for this study and this line of research that has been done before.
That's a question I was going to ask you was like, you found that, less than 25 miles per hour, there's really no collisions and no connections between the lane widths. So do we just need to post every street at 25 miles per hour? Or is it something that they could actually matter in that context, but it just doesn't show up in the data that you looked at?
So for, the way the hierarchy of street classes work is that you have freeways and highways, then you have arterials, then you have major and minor collectors and local streets. Typically, local streets or major collectors have 20 to 25 miles per hour. If you use 20 to 25 miles per hour for arterials, then you are going to end up with congestion or other similar challenges of slow traffic on those streets. Again, the point is that speed limit is not the solution for designing and planning and executing a specific driving speed for a specific street. We have to go with the design. We have to go with the design characteristics, with all those objectives, all these features that we've included in this study that comes actually from literature 30 years of literature on traffic safety and design features. All of this, every single of these could make a difference. And all together is what can make the driving speed close to what the design speed is for a particular street.
You also make a specific distinction for larger trucks and buses, and I'm curious about that finding as well.
For transit corridors, for example, we'll see that the transit vehicles such as bus or even shuttles typically are wider than a regular car. And so you see that 9-foot or even 10-foot might be a little bit challenging for the drivers, like bus drivers. And you see that in the literature as well, that the lanes that are narrow could be particularly challenging and increase the number of bus-related crashes. And so for areas that you see are transit corridors, not every street is a transit corridor. Most streets are not transit corridors. For those that are transit corridor, we think that 9 or 10 might not be, the best optimal lane widths. The same for trucks or freight transportation. We had a conversation with Oregon Department of Transportation officials, and they were mentioning that freight transportation is a big deal and a huge industry there. And so even though sometimes they want to go with narrower lanes, but they have to accommodate the size of freight and trucks and larger vehicles on those corridors. But again, we are talking about a small portion of streets on the street network. For most streets, our recommendation is that 9 or 10 foot would work.
You did have extensive discussions with state DOT officials. I'm wondering what you learned from those discussions and what stuck out to you as something interesting.
We had great conversations. I think we had interviews with 5 state DOTs, and I can mention a couple of key findings we had with Vermont DOT. We were actually, surprised to see that Vermont was one of the first states in the US. I think it goes back to early 2000 or late 1990 to have a legislative passed mentioning that if you go with 9-foot lanes, first of all, you require the DOT to come up with their own design standards instead of going with AASHTO, to have something that, kind of fits the needs and requirements of Vermont streets. And second, to give permission to DOT to go for 9-foot lanes without being liable if something happens, because that's one of the most important or serious concerns we found in our conversations, that there is the issue of liability. Vermont didn't have that in the past 25 years, but not even a single street with a 9-foot lanes have been built. Nothing, not even one case. And again, there were concerns with the 9-foot lanes being too narrow, the likelihood of increasing number of crashes, and sometimes really the convenience of going with wider lanes just to follow the standards that everyone has been following for years. The same across the other states too. We found that in most states, still AASHTO is the case. 11 to 12-foot lanes are the dominant forms of or standards for lane widths. And states have this exception rule that if there is a specific street that we want to do narrower, we go through the exception. And there's a criteria for, how the exception would happen. Very rare cases of exception. And so when we ask why, again, as I mentioned, the issue of liability, lack of data, lack of information, this general hypothesis that wider is safer in most cases is something that we observed across our interviews with different state DOTs. Some states begin to revise these standards and go with narrower. One of them was Florida DOT, which told us that they have this new design manual that I think they just released in 2023 that actually has 9-foot lanes as one of the design standards for roads that are in downtown areas, and they have a criteria for how to specify 9-foot lanes, but they have it and they are actually implemented in several cases that they mentioned to us. So that was great to hear and see.
It's so interesting because you hear about this all the time, the liability. And so everybody basically will use the green guide, the AASHTO green guide, because it reduces their liability. But on a whole, it actually increases the amount of collisions, it feels like, because of the findings that you all had, which is basically that the wider lanes mean more collisions on linear sections of road. And so it's kind of interesting to see how your report is kind of pushing back on that argument that state DOT officials, traffic engineers are going to have, that, we're just trying to reduce our liability. I'm wondering at what point does somebody sue AASHTO or somebody because their standards mean more collisions? I've been waiting for that for quite a while because I feel like there's got to be a change somewhere because we can't keep going the way that we've going with 40,000 deaths on the roads every year.
Absolutely. And I want to say that, this is a national study. Like, this is a study that is not for a specific road or a specific city or a few number of streets in a city. It includes 1,100 streets. It covers more than 21 design features. And, the data says wider lanes are more dangerous. Wider lanes increase the number of crashes. And something we heard over and over in our interviews with state DOT was that they want to see the data. They are very interested in seeing what really the quantitative analysis and the data says. Several of them ask us to send them over the report and the analysis, and they were receptive. To give you an example, Caltran, California Department of Transportation, to really consider looking at their standards and changes in its standards if we find that the data says quite counter to the general belief. So I think at least at the state level, most likely at the city level, with city departments of transportation, we see a lot of interest across the country to go for more multimodal transportation, bike lanes and sidewalks and narrower streets. Hopefully, we'll see some changes happening.
I want to know more about how you collected the data. What did you use? What forms of data did you use to put together the massive spreadsheet or Airtable or whatever it was you created to put together this report?
That's a great question, because one of the reasons that this topic is not widely studied, and the reason is data availability. When you look at traffic volume, data is available most often. You can get it from state DOTs. It's very hard to get data on micro-scale design features of street. You have to do the data collection. And it's very hard to do that and time-consuming to do that for 1,100 streets. Thanks to our supporter, the Bloomberg Philanthropies and Bloomberg American Health Initiatives, we were able to work with computer scientists and programmers to come up with machine learning techniques to look at Google Street Maps and Google Earth and Google Views, train the machines to look at a sample of cases, sample of streets, and to be able to measure most of these variables automatically for the streets. For some others, including lane widths, we still had to do it manually. But for most of our variables, we either did the machine learning and trained the computers to get the data for us from those sources, or for some of them, such as traffic volume, we were able to get it from state DOTs. But yeah, that gives us a really rich data sets. I mentioned the expansion of this project now in our center to be able to look at other outcomes, not only the number of crashes, but also the severity of crashes. How fatal are those crashes? And other environmental features, walkability, livability of streets. So we have a series of outcomes that we are now linking to that data set. And that's going to be the new analysis that will be the follow-up to this original study.
With all those, self-driving car tests going on and all the LiDAR data that they're collecting, I feel like if you could get access to that, that might actually open up a huge possibility for measuring every street in the city, every street in a region, because they're ubiquitous, they're everywhere. At least here in San Francisco they are, until crews stop operating for a little while, obviously. But I feel like that's a rich trove that might be mined at some point.
Oh, I would love to get my hands on that. That would be an amazing opportunity to, for now we have a methodology that we can use to measure these design features for any street. And with that, then we'll have information on driving behaviors, on speed, the actual speed, not speed limit, and actual traffic volume. And that would be a very cool information and analysis that will be a huge improvement over what we have now.
Yeah. How did the pandemic impact your study?
It did not, because the years of crashes we include as 2016 through 19. By purpose, we excluded pandemic because during the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw an unusual patterns of travel, driving, walking and biking, and number of crashes. And we wanted to come up with an analysis that's more generalizable than the pandemic area. But again, that's a study that could be done using the same methodology for the pandemic time as well.
So with these findings, the lane widths are crucial in thinking about traffic speeds as well as collisions. I'm wondering how hard it will be to kind of convince folks that this is an important kind of way to move forward on trying to reduce traffic collisions. One kind of example in Texas is, San Antonio was working on trying to do a road diet in the city, and they had actually gotten the road back from TxDOT, but then politically things got really messy in this, and it was even, allegedly the governor mentioned that he didn't want this to happen, and so it didn't happen. And so I'm wondering how, politically, this can actually move forward in a way that's meaningful and helpful for reducing traffic collisions.
Definitely the political environment's going to play a big role. We'll see some states are more receptive to lane narrowing, to overall multimodal transportation, walkability and bikeability than others. And so my hope is that we'll have states that are more toward active and green transportation to begin, implementing our findings and going with narrower lanes. And eventually we'll see that when we see the improvement in traffic, safety in those states, will have other states as well joining, the lead. I want to say that, as you mentioned, safety is a big deal, but equally important is having an opportunity for biking and biking. So sometimes this additional space is make a difference between having a bike lane or not, having a sidewalk or not. And I've interviewed many bicyclists that want to do biking in the city, but are just afraid because there is no biking infrastructure. And so I think this is probably the most cost-efficient way, the most feasible way to add bike lanes and wider sidewalks to the existing infrastructure while improving safety.
And the bike lanes actually help reduce collisions as well because of the width, right?
Absolutely. So the bike lane, so that will be I think, kind of the double role of lane width narrowing on safety, because that bike lanes will improve safety for bicyclists and for drivers as well. So you will see the fewer number of crashes happening, or bike-related crashes happening in the street. We are doing not good in terms of bike lane coverage in the US, Jeff. I don't know if you've been following, but I was surprised to see that, for example, the city of Dallas has only 5 miles of protected bike lanes, which is, if you imagine how much you can bike with 5 miles, really nothing. Other cities as well, like New York is like a paradise for walking and biking, and only 8% of New York streets have protected bike lane. And so I think as important as improving safety is really giving opportunity to people who want to bike and walk to be able to do that. And lane widths will give us that opportunity.
What's been the reaction so far to the research?
Positive. We were contacted by several cities in Washington, in California, here in Maryland, that were interested to see more specifically what does it mean for their city, or how they can find the most immediate candidates for lane width reduction. And I think that's a very, very positive sign of having this conversation got started, and even some cities moving toward rethinking their lane width standards or lane width reduction projects. Salt Lake City in Utah, for example, was one of the cities that were super interested. And we had conversations with them that they mentioned, if you can provide us with the list of streets that are good candidates for lane width reduction, we are gonna include them in our plan and go for lane width reduction actually on those streets, which I think that's an awesome thing to hear.
That's awesome. Where can folks find the report if they want to get a copy?
There's a website. I can share with you the link of the website that has the full report, has the key findings, narrowlanes.americanhealth.jhu.edu is where Ivan and his team, they created this beautiful website with our full report as well as key findings and the key implementation points for cities and states.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Hamidi, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate your interest in this study, and I've been following up your work, and I'm a fan, and it's a pleasure talking with you.
Well, let's not wait 7 years to talk next time.
For sure.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of the Overhead Wire and published first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters for supporting this week's podcast, and you can find out more at patreon.com/theoverheadwire. And sign up for our 17-year-old newsletter by visiting theoverheadwire.com. To get the show each week, follow along at your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, YouTube, TuneIn, Apple Podcasts, and many, many more. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.